Hello everyone. So in last session we discussed about the state management techniques and we also discussed about the session state. So today we will discuss about the other state management techniques like application state, cookie, ViewState, QueryString. So we discussed that HTTP is a stateless protocol. So we require some state management techniques, and there are two types of state management techniques, server side and the client side. In server side we have session and application, while for client side we have cookie, QueryString and ViewState. So today we'll discuss about the other state management techniques. But what is session? So session is secure, session is server side, session is individual, that is at user level, and we use the session where the security is required like login, payment and other applications. Session, there are different configuration. We can specify the timeout of the session, we can specify whether session is cookieless or not, and the session can be of three types, like the data will be stored either in process, out of process and SQL server. And how to store the data and retrieve the data into the session, that is very easy. We can just use it as a collection and we can store the key value pairs. So this is all about the session that we discussed. So the next state management technique is a application state. Again, the application state is at server side. So the data will be stored inside the server, so it is very secure. But the application state is common for all users. And how to store the data into the application, that is similar to the session, like application and some key, and we can specify the values. But as it is common across all the users, wherever we update the value in the application state, we require some locking mechanism for synchronization. So what we have to do is we have two methods, lock and unlock. So we need to call the lock method before we update the value into this application, and at last we need to unlock it. So ideally the application state is rarely used in reality, because in web we allow the simultaneous access. But if we use this lock and unlock, it is like a sequential access for that particular code. So definitely the locking generally we use only for the read-only purpose, and rarely we use it if it is needed, because the simple global variable web where we store the data in web.config can also replace this particular state. Fine. So let's see how to store and retrieve the data from the application state in our application. So let's go to the Visual Studio and we'll open our existing application, that is demo. Okay, so in this particular application what we are doing is, we have last lecture we implemented this login form. So these are login page, right? So where we have username, the password field, and when user click on this login button, we are checking the username, that email address and the password in the database, and if we get the relevant records, then we specify that user is logged in, and in that case we store the data into the session using this. And then after we allow the user to open that students.aspx. This particular page we want some restriction that only logged in user will be allowed to access. Fine. So if I go to the student.aspx, this is front end. So here we have different grid views and different controls. So let's assume that here we want that only logged in user can access. So on the page load event of the student.aspx, we are retrieving the data from the session. We check that if the session is null, if it means the user is not logged in, then we redirect the user again to the login.aspx. So anyway, user will not be able to access this page without login. So if user will log in, we have something into the session, that is email, and then we will allow the user. Fine. So it is server side, so only we can set as a developer. Fine. So it is highly secure, and then we retrieve the data. The other thing is, just we want to display that welcome message. So we have one logout button and one label. So in this particular email label, we are writing like welcome and then email address. Fine. And on the click event of this logout, we are destroying the session. There are different events, different methods of the session, like session.add, session.remove, session clear, abandon. Fine. So we can call this method. So abandon will destroy the session. So we are using that method as of now. Fine. And then we redirect again after logout, user will be redirected to the login page. So this is what we did till now. Now let's implement that application state. Now what I want in this application state, if I run this, let's open this default.aspx. Fine. So let's open the default.aspx. And let's run it. So let's see what we can do here to demonstrate the application state. Let's say we want the number of visitors, that how many visitors have access our websites, right? So even a particular user will open a particular page, then we will increment this count. Again, a user will open another page, will increment the count. Even a other user will open the same page, we will increment. So every time we want to increment, whenever user will access, any user will access any of the page. So in that case, we want something which is server side, definitely, because that value is, we want common for all the users, right? And the second thing is, again, that is individual for that is not individual for each and every user, it is common. So it is the best use of application state. So what we'll do is, here we will put in footer, we'll put some kind of count which is called visitors count. Okay, and here we are using the cookieless session. So let's again remove that code, that we want normal session, not a cookieless session. Let's use the cookie. So we'll go to the web.config file. It is in process, timeout, but I'll remove this cookieless to true. Fine. So it is now a normal session. So now this header and the footer is there in the master page. So let's write that code in the master page, and we'll also see that, okay, we can also write the code in master page. Fine. So what I want is, in this footer right here, before this UL, that is our navigation, that menu bottom side, fine, we want to display the visitors count. So let's put a label here. So there is one label at bottom side, fine, and this is visitor label. Okay, and by default the text is maybe 0 or nothing. Okay, so we want some large font in that, so you can use that Bootstrap also, or you can use this properties of .NET. So let's call this as some large value, fine, and let's see the here that, okay, so we specified extra small by mistake. Let's specify it as a larger. Okay, and x large. Okay, fine, some large value. Okay, fine. So I want this entire footer with center line. So I'll specify that CSS. Again, we can use the Bootstrap, but footer is just a HTML tag. So we will use this CSS properties, that style text align, that is center. Okay, so if you see, the 0 will be here in the middle of the screen. Okay, fine. We can also change the appearance of this, but let it be as it is right now. So we have one label. Now what I want is that when user access any of the page, so we'll write that code in the master page load. So wherever user will access any page, this load event of the master page definitely will be triggered. So here we want to update that value, that visitor label dot text is equal to, and we want to retrieve something from the application state. But before that, see, when we run the application, what I want is it should start with the 0. So how to specify that thing? And for that, again, we need some global.asx file. We already discussed this global.asx. Let's go back to and just see where we discuss it. Fine. So we already discussed this global.asx. Fine. here. Fine. So we discussed that in this global application class, wherever the session will be started and the session will be ended, we want to write some code, then we can use this particular file. And similarly, in application state also, we can use this global application class. So how to add this global application class? Like a normal page, just right click on this, add new item, and from this list you will get option for global application class, and the name of that file is global.asax. Okay, let's add it, and you'll see there are different events, common events like application start, application end. What if there is some error in the application? There is a session underscore start, session underscore end, as I said in last session. So you can write your code right here that you want globally. So right now what I want is, whenever the application will be started, I want to set that application, I want to store something, that visitor, fine, is equal to 0. So initially we have this key value pair, that visitor is equal to 0, and that I have written in the global.asax page, application underscore start. So wherever we start our application, we'll have this visitor equal to 0, and now in any of the page I can access it, right? So now what we will do here is, I want to increment that count to 1 because this is first request, right, or another request. So what I'll do is, visitor is equal to visitor plus 1, but that is again the data type we need to specify. So that is not integer, so I have to convert it into the integer. So I have casted it into the integer. So visitor, which is integer value, we know, and then we increment it by 1, and then after we will use this updated value that we want to display, and again we need to convert it to the string. So let's write visitor. So this kind of message I want to give to the user, and then let's say concatenation and to string. Okay, so now it is fine. Now what will happen here, that if more than one user will simultaneously access this particular line exactly, then let's say the current count is 100, it will become 101 only, not 2, because both will read that existing value which is 100, right? So what we need to do is, we need to lock this particular region code, and after that we need to unlock it. Definitely it is not preferable, as I said, right? So application dot unlock, fine. So this is how we can store and retrieve. Here we are doing both, we are retrieving the data as well as we are storing the updated value, fine. So this is how we retrieve, and this is how we store, and this is how we lock and the unlock, fine. Okay, now let's see the output of this. So this is all about the application state. So let's run our default.aspx or any other page, let's say login.aspx. So if I run this, bottom side we'll have the visitor count, and it will start from the beginning. So this is our first page we open. Okay, so that's why we are getting visitor is equal to 1. If I refresh this page again, then it will say visitor 2. If I go to any other page, 3, fine. So it is available in all the pages. 4, again if I open the home page, it says 5. And another thing is, if I open it in other browser, so let's say the other user is accessing it, fine. So I'll open the default.xpx and it says 6. So you can see that here we are getting 6, while that is not possible in the session because it is individual, fine. And this user will open another page, it says 7, and again this user will request the other page and it will be 8. So this is how we can use the application state, fine. So let's go back to the presentation. This is what we discussed, that how to use the application state, lock and unlock methods, fine, and how to store and retrieve the values. So we can just use key value pair. So this is all about the application state. So we discussed the server side state management technique. Now let's discuss about the client-side state management techniques, cookie, QueryString, and ViewState. So let's start with the cookie. So it is like a cookie is like a small piece of information. We store it at client side. Browser will take care about that, right? So it is ideally locally saved in the client machine. And how the cookie works, so server will set the cookie into the client, and with all other subsequent requests, client will send all the cookies to the server. So server will be able to get that cookies and act accordingly. So we discussed one of the usage of the cookie like in advertisement, interest based advertisement. Fine. When we open any of the product we browse in e-commerce website, at that time they store the cookie in our computer, in our browser. And later on when we go to any other website and there is an advertisement, and at that time they retrieve the cookie and they highlight the same product that we browsed. Fine. So this is one of the use of the cookie. Cookie data will be transferred from client to server in the HTTP header. There are different parameters we can set while setting a cookie. The important thing is key and value pair. We can have multiple value, but along with that we can set the domain, for which domain you want to set, the path. Sometimes we have specific folders, so that also we can specify, and the main thing we can set the expiration time. So ideally there are two types of cookies. The one is called persistent cookie, another one is non-persistent cookie. So like session is also stored, session ID is also stored in the cookie, but it is not persistent. Wherever you close the browser, it will be destroyed. So that is called non-persistent cookie. When we do not set the expiration time, it is non-persistent, but most of the times the user defined cookies, we want some custom expiration, and that is called the persistent cookie. And for that we use the property called expires. Fine. So as I said that HTTP cookie class we have, and we need to create an object of that, and it contains key, value. If it is multiple values, then values also. These are the properties, and along with that we have the expires, domain, and the path property. Okay. The another thing is cookie can be accessed in the web application as well as in the desktop application also, client application also. And definitely, why? Because browser, Chrome for example, we can see the cookies. Now browser is a software, desktop application, and there for example we want to create our own browser, we need to take care of the cookie. So that's why this cookie is accessible via a web application definitely, as well as the client application as well, right? And to send the cookie to the client from the server, we use the response object. So we use HTTP response, and there is a cookies property in that. And to retrieve the cookie in server from the client, we use the request. Fine. So we use HTTP request dot cookies. So again, before we go ahead in this presentation, let's see how we can use the cookie. So let's stop this application. Now what we will do, let's see, if I go to the browser and if I open that Gmail for example, we are getting this email addresses, and that is because of cookies. So let's do one thing in our application, that we have this login, and we have not set the link for that. Fine. Okay, so what I want is whenever user will successfully log in, that email address we will store and we will display it here. So user will not have to enter that email address again. User will have to enter only password if user wants to log in with that previous email address. So let's say this is my personal computer, and if we will store that email address here, it will be useful for me, right? So it is almost similar to this, but not exactly like this. Here we are getting multiple email address we can store, and here we will allow only one email address to be stored here. Fine. And for that, first of all, what we have to do is when user will successfully log into the system, we will remember the email address. Fine. So we are already using the session. Now let's use the cookie. So store data in cookie. Now when we store the data into the cookie, that when user will successfully log in to the system. Fine. At that time you will remember that okay, user might need the same email in future. So let's store it in client's computer. Fine. So for that what we need to do is the multiple way. So this is one of that. So we need to create an object of HTTP cookie. Another way is we can directly add the cookie in the response, but let's go systematically. So first we create an object of HTTP cookie. Let's say C is equal to new HTTP cookie. Okay. Now when you create a cookie, you can give the name of the cookie. If we have multiple values, we'll just give the name, and then later on we'll give the multiple key value pair. And if you want a single value, we can give the name as well as value while creating this object. So let's use this right now. So again, I'm using the email as a key. In session also we are using the email, so don't get confused between these two. We are using this session for the login purpose, and we are using this cookie just to remember the email address to increase the user experience. Fine. So we will store the email text box dot text in the cookie. So we have one cookie. We can set various properties of this cookie. Let's set at least the expiration time. So c.expires, the data type of this property is a date time. So we need to give some absolute date time. Let's say I want it for 10 days from today. So I need to give, but how to identify that floating expiration kind of thing, that if tomorrow user access the page, then from tomorrow I want 10 days. So I can use the date time functions. So there is a date time dot now, and in that there are multiple that methods like add days, add hours, add minutes. So I want it for 10 days. So I'll say 10, right? And what it will return, it will return a date time, and that is what we want, but it will return the date time from the now. It means wherever the user will access the page, from that date time it will add the 10 days. Fine. And that is what we want. Now how to delete the cookie, how to destroy the cookie. So in that case we need to set some expiration time in the backdate. So I can write like this -1, and I send this cookie to the client, and the cookie will be expired because we set some previous day expiration time, right? So this is how we can expire the cookie also. So now we set the expiration time. Similarly, as we discussed, we can specify the domain, we can specify the path also. We can also specify whether you want to allow the cookie via HTTP only. So the script, client script, will not be able to access it. Sometimes we want to avoid that cross-site scripting attack, for example, then we can use HTTP only also. Name we have already specified while creating the object, and there are two other called value and the values. So here I want a single value, so I specify it as a value, right? And if we have multiple, then also we can go for the values also. Fine. So there are different properties we can set. So right now I just want only the expiration time. Now I am done with the cookie object. What next? What I have to do is I have to add this cookie in my response. So client will have that cookie. So in that case I need to use the response object. So I'll use response, and there is a cookie property, and in that we can use add. So here we need to pass the HTTP cookie class object. We already have it with some values and some configuration like expiration time. Okay. So let's specify that. Fine. So this is how we can set the cookie, the single value cookie. Fine. Let's see what happens here, and user will be redirected to the students.aspx. So before we log in, we'll see there is no cookie called email. So go to inspect, I'll use this browser functionality application, and we are using the session. Fine. So we have this ASP.NET session ID, but you can say this is a non-persistent cookie. Fine. So as soon as you close the browser, that cookie will be destroyed. Now when I give the correct username, the password, that is CCC, right? Sorry. Fine. We are already using the session, but we are also storing the data into the cookie. So when I click on the login, user will be redirected to that students.aspx page, right? But at the same time we have a cookie, and from today, right, we have the expiration time to the 10th April, so 10 days from today, right? So this is how we can store the data into the cookie. We are not yet retrieving the data, so now where I want to retrieve the data from the cookie is in this login.aspx itself. Okay, so in this login.aspx, on the page load, fine, what I want is when user open this login.aspx, and if there is something in the cookie, we will display the data in that email text box. Fine. So let's make it little bit beautiful. So again, I'll use Bootstrap. Fine. So let's open that Bootstrap, and what I want is I want to display a text box with the button, right? So it is like a group. So I'll go to the form, that components and input groups. Okay. So I want kind of group where there is a button as well as this kind of text box. Fine. So I want a change button as well. So this is an example of that. So we want this. Okay. So let's copy this, and where exactly we want. So let me just demonstrate that. So what I want is if the user has stored the cookie, fine. So let's go to the login.aspx. In this page, if user has stored a cookie, then we want a text box, and then we want a button also, that if user wants to change it, then what to do. Fine. So in that case, what I want is for this particular box, I'll replace this text box with this code, and definitely I want a text box, so I'll put this particular text box instead of this particular input. Okay, so I'll remove that input definitely. So I specified that instead of this HTML text box, I'm using this. Okay, so let's remove this now. Okay, so there is a text box we had, and I just added it in between this, right? But there is one more button, we will put it here. We'll see why it is needed and why we have added it. So there is a change right now. So there is not a button right now, but anyway, let it be. Fine. So now how to retrieve the cookie? So for that, we will first check that whether we have this cookie in our request or not. So I'll just write if there is something in the request. So request.cookies, and the name we were using was email. So there is a key ideally for your cookie, right? So if request.cookies it's not is equal to null, it means there is something, right, in the request with cookie key is equal to email. Then we will write that email text box dot text is equal to that cookie. So this is how we can retrieve dot value. Fine, it is a single value, so I'll just use value. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to retrieve the cookie, that if cookie is set, it is not null, then we will put it into the email text box. And let's make that email text box dot text dot enable is equal to false. So we will not allow the user to change it. So at least user will have some idea that okay, we have disabled it. Now let's see the output. This is how we can retrieve the cookie, and let's see what happens. We already have the cookie. Even if you close the browser, you come tomorrow, then also cookie will be there. So you can see there is a email address. You need to only enter the password, but there is a change button, because if I want to use some other that email address, then what to do? So in Gmail they are using there is option they are giving that use another account, and then they change this form, so we can enter. And similarly, what I want is when user click on the change, I want to remove this, right, and user will be allowed to change it. So that is just a additional functionality, but this is how we can use the cookie, how we retrieve the cookie, how we save the cookie. So this is what we retrieved from the cookie. Fine. Now what will happen here if user will change? You'll click on this change, nothing will happen. So let's simply write the code for that quickly. So I'll go to the login.aspx, and it is not a button, so we need to convert it to the button. So let's put button with, let's say, a class CSS class with the is equal to the same class we will use fine, and id and the run it. So id is equal to, let's say, change button, and run it is equal to server. So we put a button instead of this particular span. Let's remove this. Let's see how it will look like. Fine, it is not coming properly, but maybe in UI it will, right? So we are not specified, okay, text properties. So let's write some code on this click event, and what I want here is that I want to enable the text box. So email text box dot enable is equal to, sorry, true, fine. And we also want to delete the content from that email text box, so user can enter anything now. So text box dot text is equal to blank. Even we can disable this particular button itself, fine. So that we can do, and we want to specify some text here. So text is equal to change, okay. And let's completely disable this. So the another thing is we can also use this HTML in our code behind. If we write runnet is equal to server, and in that case we need to give some id to this. So let's say this is change div. So now this is HTML, and still I can access it in a code behind. So now I can use that change div. I'll definitely get only HTML properties. So there is a visible property is equal to false, okay. So what I did is I just made it little bit beautiful, and let's see the output of this now, that we are getting the same output like this, right? But there is a button change, and when I click on the change, it will be converted to the normal text box. So at least I have the option to enter some other email address. Now what will happen here is, even I enter some other email address, let's say aaa@, fine, and I enter the password, then also when I click on the login, it will consider CCC, because what happens is when I click on the login, first that page underscore load again will be triggered. So what will happen in page load, we have written this code that we will replace, if there is a cookie, yes, there is a cookie, so we replace the data again to the text box. So we entered that AAA, but it will be replaced again with the CCC. So what I want this is only when there is no postback, then and then we want to do this. So I'll write this code in a condition that if there is no postback, then and then do that. So for that I have to use page dot is postback property, similar to is valid. And what I want, if there is no postback, so if not page dot is postback, then and then we will retrieve the data from the cookie and we use it. Is it fine? So if there is a postback, consider that changed email address, fine. So let's open this login.aspx. So I have, again, let's see that CCC. If I log in with that same credentials, and for that account I'll click on login, fine, it will work properly. But when I want to use some another account, I can click on the change, I can use that AAA. Let's see whether password is correct or not. Yeah, it is correct. So now I logged in with AAA@AAA.a, fine. And now this particular email will be stored, because we store only one value. So I'm getting this AA@AA, and I can change anytime, or I can use the same login. So this is the example of the cookie, how to store the data, how to retrieve the data from the cookie. Okay. So let's go to the presentation. Let's see how to store the data into the cookie. So we need to create an object of HTTP cookie class. We need to give key value pair, and we need to add it into the response. We are not setting expiration, so it is non-persistent cookie. But we can use like cookie, this object name dot expires dot domain dot path, all properties we can set. And other end, we need to retrieve the cookie. So you can store it into again an object, but what we are doing is we are directly retrieving the value, right, and we are storing it into some variable. Okay. So that retrieve the cookie, we need to use the request, because with all subsequent requests, client will send the cookie to the server, and we can retrieve it from the request. Okay. So this is how we retrieve the cookie. Next state management technique is parameterized address. We call it as QueryString. So sometimes we pass the data into the URL after question mark, and that is called the query string. We already discussed that the best example of the query string is when you search in Google, right? So if I open, last lecture we discussed that if I search for the cricket, this particular data has been appended into the URL that we have searched for the cricket. Definitely it is not at all secure. Anybody can change, so I can change it to the football. Even the cookie is also not secure, because as we discussed, we can see, we can change, we can remove the cookie data easily from the browser. So these are the two cookies, I can remove it also, right? So client side state management techniques are not secure definitely, but no way to change this visitor because it is server side, it is because of application state. So this is how we use the cookie, that we want to pass some data from one page to another page, and it is only applicable to that targeted page. We can use the query string, and the thing is, it is not secure. Fine. Even in the paginess, and mostly we use, so when I click on, let's say, page 3, again they specified that start is equal to 20 or something like that, right? So this is what they do, and they specify, Google specify multiple parameters. We need to separate it with the ampersand. We can also do the same thing. Okay, so this is a query string after question mark in the URL we add, right? Now technically let's see how we can store the data and how we can retrieve the data from the query string. So this is what we discussed, that what is query string. So in default.aspx page you want to pass some tab ID, then we need to add it as a a redirect or a hyperlink or a get method of the form. There are multiple ways to add the data into the query string. And on the other hand, whenever you want to retrieve, we can use the request, and request.queryString. Query string is a collection, so multiple query string parameters you can use, you can retrieve. So tab ID here we are passing, so here we are retrieving the tab ID, and that we can store somewhere in variable. Okay, so this is about the query string. Again, let's go back to our application and let's see where we can use the query string. So if I run this project, you can see that if I log into the page, let's say AAA, and I click on the login, fine, I'm here. But when I log out, I'm redirected to this page, but I want to give some message that logout successful. And when user enters, let's say student.aspx, it means user will try to access this page, which is secure page or secure page. And when user open that, again we are redirecting to the user to the login, but there is no message. So I can give that message also. So for that I can use the query string, because it is not at all secure. If user will temper that message, user will get that message, right? So in the students.aspx page, what we are doing here is in login page, right? So sorry, in the page load we are checking for the session. If there is no session, then we redirect the user to the login.aspx, while here I'll use some query string. So I want to give one message, right? So I'll concat it with some message or some fixed the variable directly we can also write. But first of all, when we append something into the query string, we should encode it properly. So we can use that server object, and we can use server.url encode, because few characters are not a valid character. Simply we cannot use equal to in the query string, right? Because if we use that equal to into the query string, it will consider that this, let's say the message is equal to like 20 equal to 20. So this is a confusion. Even we cannot use ampersand, because when I want to give this kind of message that 2 and 200, if I write ampersand, it will be considered as a separate parameter, right? So there are invalid characters which we need to encode properly, and for that we can use server.url encode. So what it will do, it will encode the given string, whatever you are giving, a string or a variable, it will encode it properly. Fine. So wherever there is a space, it will be encoded with the plus also, right? So what I want to give the message is like error is equal to, fine. So this is my query string parameter, error is equal to and this is my value, and I'll encode my value properly using server.url encode, and this is the message I want to pass. You can give the variable if it is a dynamic data, right, like a pagination or something like, but this is simple static message I want to give, so just a simple message. So let's see what will happen. So when user will try to access this particular page, student.aspx, let's run that page, and we will be redirected to the login.aspx if we are not logged in, and you can see this message that error is equal to login required. So this is how we can append the data into the query string. But definitely we are not getting anything here. Why? Because we are not retrieving this query string. We are storing, we are appending. Fine. So what I want is, I want to retrieve this data from the query string, and I want to display it here, the same data. Fine, because each and every user will not read this query string definitely. And you can see there is a plus, so we have encoded it properly, right? So now in this login.aspx, fine, we will try to retrieve the data. So again, let's write add data in query string, fine, and in this login.aspx, fine, we are retrieving the data from the cookie, and similarly we will also retrieve the data from the query string, fine. So let's retrieve data from query string. Now what I want is, if there is a query string, so in that case again I can check in the request, like cookie, there is a query string also. So if request.queryString, and we know that we are passing a message with the key as error, so we check that if there is something with the key error in the query string, so if it is not is equal to null, right, and then we will do something, and what I want is, I want to display that message in that message label. So message label dot text, and here we need to decode the URL. So I'll decode the URL, server dot URL decode, because there we are encoding, and here we need to decode that particular value, fine. And this value I'll pass it as a parameter, so that value will be decoded and will be displayed in this message. And I want this error, so I'll just set message label dot css, this is just an add-on, right, is equal to alert and danger. Okay, so let's see what will happen. Again, if I open this student.aspx, you can set any page as a start page. Just right click on the page, and there is option for set a start page. So frequently if you want to test a particular page, you can change the start page also. Okay, so right now let's just open the student.aspx, and you will be redirected to the login.aspx with some query string login required, and here we are retrieving the data, and we display that login is needed. So user will have the idea that user will not be allowed to access that students.aspx without login, fine. And even in the logout we can give the message, right. So let's pass the another query string data, query string parameter in the logout button. So we have this same page, fine. So let's redirect the user. We are already redirecting, fine. So here in login.aspx, and there we will also redirect the user with, let's say, alert as a parameter I'm passing is equal to logout successful. So at least user will have that satisfaction, fine. So logout successful. So user will be redirected again. When user will click on the logout button, user will be given a message that logout successful. But at the same time, now the parameter is different, so we need to write one more code to retrieve in login.aspx page load. So again we will need a kind of same thing, that if there is something alert, then again we want to retrieve that alert anyway, fine, and we will give it as either alert, or let's call it as success rather than alert, fine. So user will have that color, so alert success. Now let's see, if I open this student.aspx, I'll be redirected to the login.aspx, because yet we have not logged in, so I'll just specify the correct username, the password, and click on login. So fine, we are logged in. Okay, and now when we click on logout, previously we were not getting any message that whether we successfully logged out or not. When I click on this, it will say logout successful. So if user will temper this message, right, anyway, doesn't matter that logout failed, but we know we logged out the user. Fine, so it is not secure, but fine, security is not needed here even. Okay, so this is all about the query string. The last state management technique, let's go to the presentation now, right? So we discussed that what is a query string. So now the last state management technique is called the view state, where the data will be stored in the hidden field. So what is hidden field? So it is like a input type is equal to hidden. As a developer, we can deal with it. We can store and retrieve the data from it, but the end user will not be able to see in the browser. Definitely they can see that in the code, so it is not secure again. Fine. So view state is a built-in state management technique that in ASP.NET there is a built-in state management. So we discussed that if we change the property or the values of a certain control, right, it will be remembered. So for that purpose, it's that ASP.NET use the view state, right, in each and every post back. Fine. But we can also use the view state for our purpose. But the thing is, the view state is for a particular page. If we store the data in one page of a view state, we cannot retrieve the data in another page of that view state. Fine. And it works with the even the post back only. Fine. If you come tomorrow and you open that website again, definitely will not get that data. So how to store the data in view state? So again, it is like key value pairs of view state, and you specify certain keys and the value. Okay. So sometimes we can use this view state where we want something to save for a particular page temporarily. So we can go for the view state. So let's see one application of the view state also. And before that, let me just explain that where we are already using, I mean ASP.NET is already using the view state. So we already discussed in last session that we have this button, kind of this functionality. Fine. So let me just demonstrate. So okay, so we are here. So by default we have the view state. So when you click on the button, we have written the code to make it red, and we have this code that when we click on the button, we have written the code to make it as green, but this is red and it remains as it is because of the view state. So if you look at the source code of this particular page, you will find one hidden field, right? So you can see, just 1 minute. Fine. So if you see the source code of this, you can find that there is a hidden field with view state, and these are the values that ASP.NET will store and will retrieve to manage the view state. Fine. So okay, now let's retrieve and store the data into the view state from our side. So what I want is, let's say in login page, what we want to give is number of failed attempts. So at least this is just for the the user's attention, that user had provided the incorrect username and the password for 3 times, right? So let's write a code for that, how to store and retrieve the data in the view state. So in the login.aspx, if user will provide the incorrect data, it means we are here, and here we'll store the data in view state. Fine. So first of all, we'll check whether we have any data in view state or not. So I'll just directly use that if that view state, and let's say the key is login attempt or just attempt is not is equal to null. Fine. So if the login attempt is not is equal to null, then what we'll do is we'll increment that login attempt, right? So plus is equal to 1. Let's make it like this properly. Okay, fine. Again, we need to cast it as a integer because we know that is integer. So if there is a login attempt, if it is not null, then we will increment the login attempt by 1, and if it is null, this is the first failed login, let's say, then we will specify login attempt is equal to 1. Okay, so instead of just giving that message as invalid credentials, so this is what we are doing. We are retrieving the data from that view state, as well as we are updating and we are storing the data into the view state. Fine. So we are giving that invalid credentials, and at the same time we want to give another message. So I'll just use that message label dot text plus is equal to, let's say, attempt, and then I want to give that login attempt. Fine. So this is the first attempt or second attempt or third attempt or what. Fine. So you can also use this to string. Okay. So what I am doing is invalid credential is a message, and after that we are appending that attempt 1, 2, 3, right? So let's call it as a failed attempt 1, failed attempt 2, and failed attempt 3. So this is how we store the data into the view state. Here also we are retrieving definitely, but this is the, we can say that we are retrieve data in view state. So we are retrieving the data specifically here. So let's see how it works. So if I go to the login.aspx, when I enter some incorrect username and the password, let's say 4 or any other password I'm giving, and when I click on login, it will say invalid credentials, failed attempt 1. If I enter again some incorrect password, it will say failed attempt 2. So to update this value, see, HTTP is stateless protocol. It is not having any idea that this is a second failed attempt or a third failed attempt. So we are using this state management technique called ViewState. We store and we retrieve the data for each and every failed attempt. So this is how we can use the ViewState, one of the example of that, right? So if you write again incorrect username the password, it will say failed attempt. But the thing is, if you open it again, it is not a post back, and when you try some different password, it will say failed attempt 1. Though here the failed attempt is 3, right? Because this is new request, it is not a post back. Fine. In our default.aspx also, even if we go to that home page and if I make this button as red, and if I open it again, it won't be red definitely. Fine. So this is not possible to remember that using this view state. Now at application level, we can enable or disable the view state using that web.config file. So if you don't want at all the view state functionality, we can specify that pages, and then there is a enable view state, and we can make it as false. So there will be no view state in entire application. Fine. If you don't want it at the page level, so we discussed that you can specify it in a page directive that enable view state, right, is equal to false. And even at a control level, we can specify that if you want that view state functionality or for that particular control or not. So if I select any of the control, this .NET control, there is a property called enable view state. So if I change it to false, this control will not participate in a view state. So the data will not be stored in the view state. Fine. So this is all about the state management techniques. We discuss session, application. These two are server side, then cookie, QueryString, and the view state, and these three are the client side. So as we discussed, this is how the data will be stored for the view state. It will be stored in a hidden field. Fine. And we can configure the views view state at page level using the page directive, control level also using the property, right? We can also specify whether you want the encrypted value or not. So that also we can specify in the page directive. So this is all about the state management in ASP.NET. Before we close this today's session, I want to demonstrate one more thing. We have some time. So let me tell you one thing, that web.config file is very good for the configuration, application level configuration. We can specify here, like we can store the connection string, we can store the different parameter, that configuration for the session state, whether you want in process, out of process. We can specify the theme functionality, theme settings also. Even as we discussed, there is a enable view state, you want to disable or enable a particular view state, then also we can use this web.config file. You can set whether you want the debugging or not. We can also set the framework also. We can also specify some global we can say that kind of variables, key value pairs. Let's say I will specify one key that add that key is equal to, let's say, my company name, and the value is equal to, let's say, ABC Private Limited. So what will happen that everywhere, for example, in the title of the page, I want to specify the company name. If I write the static value ABC Private Limited, when I change it or when I give the same, you can say, the software to some other company, you need to make changes everywhere. So in that case, we can specify the app settings that key company name is ABC Private Limited. So what will happen that if I go to my default.aspx, let's say, and how to retrieve it. So on the page load, fine, I can use that system.configuration, the same namespace we were using to retrieve the connection string, right? And there is a configuration manager, fine. So configuration manager dot, there is a app settings. We also have the connection string here, fine, and we can specify that company name, fine, and let's call to string. Okay, so this is how we can retrieve. Now what I want to give it as a title, so dynamically I can specify that this dot title is equal to this. So this is how we can retrieve the value from that web.config file, and what we are setting is dynamically we are changing the title page of this, fine. So if I run this application, I'll get that ABC in this default.aspx. You can see there is no title in other pages, fine, while here we are getting this now ABC Private Limited. So in each and every page you want to specify, you can write the similar code, but it is dynamic, fine. So anytime you can make changes in web.config file from ABC to XYZ Private Limited, fine. So this is how we can use this web.config file for the configuration. The another important configuration in the web.config file is we can enable the tracing also, like, right. So let's make the tracing enable true, and I want it on a page level only, so I'll specify the page output to true. Now what does it mean, this tracing? So I enable the tracing and I want the output in the same page. As of now, in real time we don't display it in a page, we display it in a separate trace file, so we can trace that what user did and what is the different value. You can also specify that whether you want it only locally or in all the requests, so we can have this local only also, fine, and how many requests you want to trace, that is also we can specify. So I specified that tracing enable true and I want the output in a page. Now let's see what will happen when I open any of the page. I can see everything regarding the request at the bottom of this. So this is the page, and after that you can see there is a session ID, time, encoding, the get or post methods, which page lifecycle event fired when or how much time, right? So pre-init, init, complete, all these are the, we discussed that there is a page lifecycle events, right? Different controls they rendered, right? So for that also we can get the information. If there is something in the session, we can see what is there in session, we can see what is there in application state. You know, there is a visitor, fine. So we stop the application, so visitor that particular application state will restart from the 1 because we have written something on application underscore start, fine. And what is there in the cookie? So I can see there are 2 cookies. One is session, that session ID only, there is no definitely the email address because we are not logged in, but session ID will be there. We are using the session functionality, it doesn't mean that we are logged in, fine. So there is another variable in the cookie, that is a we stored, right, and we can give, we can say see the different information of the header also. So fine, whenever sometimes we are getting some error, we are not able to find out that what is the problem, you can make this tracing enable and at least you will get some detailed information regarding your request, fine. So that is also possible using that web.config file. We can also do one more thing, that wherever there is an error, we want to redirect the user to some particular page. So right now, what happens that if you right now debugging is true, So let's see what happens that if the debugging is true and we already have that AAA. So if I will try to enter the same user again. So we have not used try catch, so it is like a primary key violation, right? So when I enter the same email address which is already there in the database, so it will violate the primary key and the exception will be thrown. We are not catching that exception. So when I click on the register button, I am getting this that there is some exception because the debugging is true. Now let's see what if the debugging is false. So again, if you don't want this debugging functionality, I can make again from the web.config file from the false, from the true to the false. And now again I'll open that register.aspx, will run it again. Visual Studio will ask you that whether you want to enable the debugging. No, right now I don't want to enable debugging. I know I have disabled it. Fine. And if you see here again, if you enter, okay, fine, you will get this kind of again output here, but at least that exception in Visual Studio will not occur. Let's see, 6 digit maybe we have to enter. Okay, fine. And when I click on the register, I'm getting directly this. Fine, that this particular exception. So we are getting this here. Now what I want is, I don't want to give this message to my user, right? What I want is whenever there is an error, user should be redirected to a particular page, and we will create a common page for that. So let's say we have one error page. We can specify the custom errors, and there we can specify that default redirect is, let's say, /error.aspx. okay, and we want the mode to on, that we want the custom error, right? We can specify remote only, so in developer environment it will not redirect, but at least for end users it will redirect. Fine. So right now we want on, we want to see here also. So we specified that redirect page is this and the mode is on. There are different other properties also we can specify. Okay, so we can also specify the custom errors. Now let's see what will happen. Again the same thing we will do. So without, again, if you enable the debugging, doesn't make any difference. And if I enter the same username, the password, so there is some error, right? Let's click on register and we will be redirected to this error.aspx. Fine. So user will get only that message that there is something problematic, please try after some time. So we can make this, with some proper formatting, right? And we are getting that query string that which